The morning the trucks came, nobody in Millhaven was ready. Not the tow driver who'd eaten at her window twice that week and couldn't meet her eyes when he climbed down from the cab. Not the 40 people standing between the machinery and the little painted trailer with their coffee cups and their folding chairs and their 80-year-old legs that still held. Not the man in the expensive barn coat who had grown up 2 streets over and come back with money and a plan and the absolute certainty that this corner was already his. A rusted trailer, a dead woman's secret, $9. That was all it had taken to start this. Somewhere inside that dented metal shell, hidden in a bench seat for 40 years, sealed in oilcloth against the day someone would finally be desperate enough and ready enough to find it, was a deed, a ledger full of forgiven names, and a letter that ended mid-sentence. The trucks idled. The crowd didn't move. And at the serving window, the griddle was already hot.
Have you ever watched a room full of people laugh at someone who had absolutely nothing left, and then watched that person prove every single one of them wrong? Stay with me, because what happened in this small town in rural Ohio is the kind of story I still think about at 2 in the morning. Patricia Holloway counted the money 3 times. The number didn't change, $9, 4 singles, a 5 that had been folded so many times the crease had gone soft and white like an old scar. 47 cents in coins she'd picked from the bottom of her coat pocket, while the motel clerk looked at the wall instead of at her, which was a kindness she hadn't asked for and couldn't afford to refuse. $9.47. That was the entire financial summary of Patricia Holloway at 52 years old. She sat on the edge of the motel bed and looked at the money laid out on the bedspread and tried to remember the last time she'd felt like herself. Not the version of herself that smiled at school functions. Not the version that said, "We're fine" when people asked. The real one. The one who used to hum while she cooked. The one who knew, without thinking about it, exactly how long a sheet of dinner rolls needed in a 400-degree oven before they went from pale to gold. That woman felt very far away. The checkout notice had been slid under the door sometime around midnight. She'd heard the soft scrape of it but hadn't gotten up to look. She'd already known what it said. The card had been declined twice at the front desk, once 2 days ago and once yesterday afternoon, and Larry Dutton, the night clerk, a quiet man in his 50s with the careful eyes of someone who'd seen a lot of people hit their lowest point at the front desk of a budget motel, had been as decent about it as a person could be while still doing his job. On the bedside table sat a Folgers coffee can. The red and blue label had faded to a washed-out version of itself. Inside, a stack of index cards, each one covered in her mother's handwriting. A slant that leaned to the right as if the letters were trying to outrun something. Meatloaf for a crowd. Bread that stretched. Soup from almost nothing that still sent people home full. Patricia had fought to keep that can in the divorce. Richard had let her have it because it was worth nothing to him. Almost everything else had been worth something to Richard. And almost everything else Richard kept. 28 years. She'd married him at 24 and signed whatever he set in front of her because that was how it was done back then. Or at least that was how it was done in their particular corner of the world. And because she had trusted the man across the table. The house was in his name. The savings account was in his name. Their retirement was structured in ways she hadn't understood at the time and had been too tired to question later. When the lawyers finally added everything up, Patricia's share came to a checking account that wouldn't cover a month of groceries. 22 years she'd run the kitchen at Claremont Elementary. 600 lunches a day. She'd known which kids came through the line with that particular flatness, behind the eyes that meant no breakfast, and she'd kept rolls back for them. Tucked under the counter where the principal couldn't see, because the district had opinions about portions, and Patricia had opinions about children going hungry, and she'd always been very clear about which opinion mattered more. Then the district had closed Claremont and abused the kids 2 towns over, and sent her a letter thanking her for her service, printed, not signed. 2 years of part-time work after that, shifts that started and quietly evaporated, and then the marriage ended loudly, the way things that have been quiet too long sometimes do. And then this motel, and then last night, and then this morning, and then $9. She heard Larry's voice again, the way he'd filled the silence, while her card was being declined for the 2nd time. He hadn't been unkind about it. He'd just been talking. The way people talk when a situation becomes uncomfortable and words are easier than silence. Something about the county surplus auction, over behind the old fairgrounds. They sold off whatever nobody claimed. Cars sometimes. Campers. Cheap if you had cash. Somebody had bought a whole boat last spring for $11. Patricia hadn't wanted a boat. She'd lain awake doing the only math she had left. And by the time the sky outside went from black to dark gray, she had arrived at the only conclusion the numbers supported. $9 would not rent a room. $9 would not put her on a bus to anywhere that made sense. But $9 was $9, and that was something, and the auction started at 8. She put on her good coat, which was 2 winters old, and showed it in the left cuff, and she walked to the fairgrounds in the cold. The auction lot sat behind a chain-link fence on cracked asphalt. Trucks and flatbeds crowded the entrance. Men in canvas work coats moved through the rows with coffee, taking their time, kicking tires, lifting hoods with the easy confidence of people who could afford to be unhurried. Patricia stood at the edge in her good coat and watched the auctioneer work. He moved fast. A dump truck went for $400. A tractor with no seat went for $90. A pallet of copper pipe started a small war between 2 men who visibly hated each other, which the rest of the crowd seemed to enjoy in the specific way that people enjoy a conflict that doesn't involve them. She didn't raise her hand once. She couldn't afford to want anything until the very end. So she walked the rows while the useful lots sold and looked at things she had no money to buy and practiced being invisible, which was not as hard as it used to be. 22 years behind a serving line had taught her how to move through a space without registering. She'd been invisible in that way for a long time. It turned out the skill transferred. The trailer sat in the last row, past the useful things, past the lots anyone had bothered to clean up in the section reserved for what the county considered a lost cause. It was small. A canned ham camper, the kind a family might have hitched to a station wagon back when station wagons were a thing people drove without irony. One corner of the roof had folded inward like a soda can someone had stepped on. The tires were flat and gray with age and neglect. Someone had sprayed the number 41 on the side in orange paint with the energy of a person who had given up caring whether it was straight. The auctioneer called it like a man calling something he'd been stuck with. Lot 41. Travel trailer, as is. Where is? County impound. 8 years, no title issues. Just fees nobody paid. Sold as scrap. Who would start at 50? Nobody moved. Who would give him 50? Come on, good aluminum in it. A man near the front. I'll give you a box of matches and a can of gas. The crowd laughed. The auctioneer smiled the smile of a man who had heard that joke in this exact context so many times it had stopped being funny to him sometime around 2019. 25 then. Anybody, fine. How about 10? Patricia walked closer. She didn't know why. She could feel the $9 in her pocket like a fact she kept bumping into. Something about the way the trailer just sat there, being laughed at, getting nothing right. Unable to defend itself, it reached through the cold and grabbed something in her chest and held on. She got close enough to put her hand on the metal side. The surface was cold and pitted with rust and grime and what might have once been paint. She ran her thumb along it without meaning to, and there it was, under the grime, faint as a bruise. Someone had painted a bird, small, blue. The wing was lifted, tilted upward, caught at the moment before flight, the moment when something has decided it's going to go and hasn't gone yet. She didn't know what she was doing. She found out at the same moment the auctioneer did. 9. The word came out of her mouth steadily, which surprised her, because her hands were not steady at all. The auctioneer looked up, found her. A beat of actual silence moved through the lot. Honey, keep your $9, a woman's voice, carrying clearly from somewhere in the crowd. Patricia knew the voice. She had put mashed potatoes on that woman's son's tray for 6 school years running. That thing is a tetanus shot on wheels. Laughter came in a wave, easy, warm, the comfortable kind people allow themselves when they're not the target. Patricia kept her hand on the bird. She did not turn around. 9 going twice. Sold for $9 to the lady who likes a project. The gavel came down. Ma'am, 48 hours to move it or it reverts. She paid at the folding table by the gate. The clerk counted her 9 singles into a gray cash box without looking up and slid a yellow receipt across. She folded it into her pocket next to nothing else. And then she walked back to the trailer she now owned and had absolutely no means of moving. That was where George Tanner found her. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, built low and wide, with white hair cut close to his skull, and the kind of hands that told a full biography. If you looked, the grease worked so deep into the knuckle lines that it had become part of the texture of him. A patch on his coat bore the name of a salvage yard she had driven past 1,000 times and never needed. He looked at the caved roof and the flat tires and the orange number. Then he looked at her standing next to the thing with her hand still resting on the faded bird, in her good coat. 2 winters old. You bought lot 41. Not a questions. He rubbed his jaw. Said he did the county's hauling. Half these lots ended up towing most of them to the crusher anyway. He looked at the trailer again, then at her, the way a person looks when they're running a calculation they're not going to explain. He asked if she had somewhere to put it. No. George nodded once, slowly. That was the answer he'd expected, maybe even the one he'd been hoping for. He told her about the old rail depot, the corner lot downtown that had been sitting empty since before either of them had gone gray, that the county was supposed to mow and didn't, that nobody used. He'd drop her there. Wouldn't cost a thing. Why would you do that? Because this morning I hauled 3 good machines to the crusher that weren't half as interesting as a canned ham camper nobody was supposed to want. He hooked his chains under the frame without ceremony. The practiced ease of 10,000 identical jobs. Junk is just something waiting for the right pair of hands. You'll figure out which one this is. The trailer groaned when it was lifted. Rust fell in a fine powder. The little blue bird tilted up toward the gray sky like it was trying to make good on its original promise. They rode downtown with the heater running and the radio turned low. George didn't ask her story, which she was more grateful for than she could have expressed, without embarrassing herself. He asked instead if she cooked, because he'd noticed the Folgers riding on her lap like a passenger she intended to keep safe. For a living, most of my life. A pause. School kitchen. He drummed the steering wheel once with 2 fingers, said nothing else, but something moved behind his face. Some thought he picked up carefully and set back down. The depot corner was where the main street gave out. The old station building stood boarded and sway-backed behind it. The lot itself was a rectangle of cracked asphalt with knee-high weeds and a single streetlight that had given up. Across the street, a hardware store and a shuttered pharmacy looked on with dark windows. George backed the trailer into the corner nearest the depot wall, chalked the frame with 2 cinder blocks, stepped back and looked at it. He told her the roof would leak where it had caved in. He had a tarp at the yard she could have. He went back to the truck and returned with a work light on a hook, a coil of extension cord, and 2 jugs of water. He plugged the cord into an outdoor outlet on the depot's back wall, and to the surprise of both of them, it hummed to life. The depot, he said, was still on the town's meter. Nobody had ever cut it off. He hung the light inside the trailer's door, and told her not to mention it to the mayor. Then he touched 2 fingers to his brow and left. The cold came up through the asphalt as the light drained away. The one traffic signal at the far end of the street blinked yellow over nothing at all. Patricia climbed the single metal step, stood in the doorway of the thing she now owned, and made herself look at it honestly. It was worse inside than out. The caved corner had let in years of rain, and the far wall was black with mildew that had taken up permanent residence. A dinette bench sat under the roadside window, just a plywood box with a hinged lid. The cushion gone so long ago there was no indentation left to show it had ever existed. A narrow counter ran along the opposite wall, and above the counter, screwed flat against the paneling, a rectangle of plywood covered what should have been a window. She ran her sleeve along the wall to clear the grime and found the color underneath. The bird again, here. Sheltered from the weather, it was sharper. Blue with a white breast. The wing lifted at that same frozen angle, and beneath it, in hand lettering that had faded but hadn't entirely surrendered, 2 words. The Bluebird. Patricia touched the letters. She had lived in this town most of her adult life and had never heard of any bluebird. But somebody had painted this with intention, with care, with enough belief in the thing to give it a name. She set the Folgers can on the counter because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. A counter with something on it looked less like a wreck and more like a place. Her phone buzzed. Kevin's name on the screen, her son, 26 years old. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. His voice came through with that particular edge in it, not anger exactly, but a tired disappointment he hadn't developed on his own. Dad said you bought a camper at the county auction. Please tell me that's not true. It's true, Mom. She heard him exhale. You cannot live in a broken-down trailer downtown where the whole town can see you. Do you understand how this looks? Someone already texted me a picture of it on the flatbed. I imagine they did. Sell it for scrap. George Tanner will give you something for the aluminum. Take the money. Come stay in Dad's basement until you get yourself sorted, he offered. He's trying to help. Patricia looked at the faded bird glowing in the work light and thought about what Richard's help had looked like for 28 years. Your father spent 28 years helping himself. I'll pass on his basement, Kevin. The line went quiet. When Kevin came back, the edge was gone, and what replaced it was worse because it was shame. You're making this hard for everybody. He hung up. She put the phone face down on the counter and did not cry. She had cried enough in the motel room, and it had never once moved the number in her pocket. The dog arrived without a sound. She didn't hear him on the step. He was simply there in the doorway, a shepherd mix, brown and black, a torn ear, every rib present and accounted for. Not a young dog. He stood at the threshold with his head low and his eyes on her, running some private evaluation she couldn't read the rubric for. I have nothing. She said it plainly, not unkindly. I need you to understand that of everyone in this town tonight, you have found the one person with genuinely nothing to offer. The dog walked in. He went directly to the dinette bench, put his nose to the seam where the lid met the frame and sniffed the full length of it. Then he scratched at the hinged edge with one paw, looked at her, let out a low, urgent whine. That's a bench. There is nothing inside a bench. He scratched again, harder, with more conviction. She stood to let him at it. He planted both front feet and worked at the lid with a single-mindedness that was starting to raise the hair on the back of her neck. She had grown up with dogs. She knew the difference between an animal asking for something and an animal trying to tell you something. This was the second one. She tried the lid herself. It didn't move, not locked, but the hinge had rusted solid and something inside wood swollen from years of moisture. Or something wedged or both held it fast. She worked her fingers under the lip and pulled until her knuckles went white. Nothing gave. The dog looked at the counter. George had left a small toolkit with the work light, a flathead screwdriver with a cracked yellow handle. Patricia took it and knelt on the cold floor and worked the blade into the seam of the lid, while the dog pressed against her side, warm and trembling with the effort of waiting. The old wood squealed. A line of it splintered pale along the crack. She threw her weight against the handle, and with a sound like a gunshot in a tin can, the lid tore free of whatever had been holding it and swung up on its ruined hinge. Inside the bench, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brown with age, lay a bundle the size of a bread loaf. The dog went completely still. Patricia reached in with both hands. The moment her fingers closed around it, she understood whoever had wrapped this had wrapped it to last, had wrapped it to be found, had believed, with whatever certainty was available to them at the time, that someday somebody would be ready to look. She peeled the oilcloth back one stiff fold at a time, the dog putting his nose to every inch as it opened. Inside was a coffee tin, a twin to the one sitting on her counter, the one that held her mother's recipes. The lid was sealed with a ring of brittle yellow tape. When she worked the lid loose, the smell that came up was old paper and cold grease and something faintly sweet, like a kitchen that had been closed for a very long time and was only now being asked to remember what it was for. The tin was full, a thick bundle of index cards held with a rubber band that dissolved into powder when she touched it. A stack of photographs with scalloped white edges, the kind from a drugstore photo counter sometime in the 1970s. A composition book, the cover black and marbled, worn soft at every corner, and on top of everything, folded once, a single sheet of lined paper with 2 words written on the outside in a firm, slanting hand. Read me. She looked at the photographs first, because a face is easier than a letter. The top photograph showed this trailer, but young. The bird on its side was bright and clear, the wing lifted and hopeful, and the window she now knew was hidden under that plywood panel was open and folded down into a small serving counter. Behind the counter stood a woman, white, broad-shouldered, plainly built. Somewhere around 40, her hair tied back under a kerchief, her sleeves shoved up past the elbow. She was handing a plate across to a man in a canvas work coat with a lunch pail hooked over his arm. Behind him, a line of men stretched back out of the frame. On the counter, propped where anyone waiting could read it, was a hand-lettered board. Hot plate 25 cents. If you're short this week, eat anyway. Someone had written on the back, in that same slanting hand. The gate, the first bad winter. Patricia went through the rest slowly. The woman aged across the stack. She got grayer, heavier, the lines in her face deepening from one photograph to the next. But she was always at that window. There was always a line. In one she laughed with her head thrown back, the kind of laugh that takes over a person's whole body. In another she spooned something into a child's bowl while the child watched her with the flat, serious attention of a kid who was genuinely, not casually, hungry. Patricia knew that look. She'd served 600 of those looks a year. The composition book was a ledger. Down the left side, names, hundreds of them in that same hand. Beside each name, small amounts, $1, $2.50. Most had a line drawn through them and a note beside the line. Paid Friday, paid in canned corn. Ha, gone to Ohio for cast on God rest him, forget it. Whole columns of small debts. Whole columns of them forgiven. The dog had settled against her leg. Patricia realized she'd been reading by the worklight for a long time. The cold had gotten deep into her knees and her lower back. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting here was harder to read. It shook at the edges, the way handwriting does when the hand producing it no longer has the same grip on things it once did. If you found this, then the bluebird is yours now, and I expect you didn't pay much for her. That's all right. I never charged much either. My name is Dorothy Pruitt. I ran this wagon at the canning factory gates the winter they shut the line down, and 40 families in this town went hungry at the same time. I couldn't fix the factory. I could fix a hot plate of something. So that is what I did every day, for as long as there was a day. Feed people first. The books can wait. A town that keeps its griddle warm can survive just about anything. There is more I have to tell you, but my hand is tired tonight and the light is going. Come back tomorrow. I will still be here. The letter stopped there, mid-thought, like the writer had set the pen down meaning to pick it back up in the morning. Patricia sat with it in her lap a long while. Then she folded it carefully along its original crease, set it on the counter next to the Folgers can, and lay down on the bare wooden bench with her coat for a blanket and the dog for a furnace. She slept better than she had in a year. George came back a little after 7 the next morning. He found her outside on the trailer step in the gray early light, the photographs spread across her knees. The dog stretched over her feet like he'd been assigned there. You've got company. His name is Duke. He looks like a duke. George made a sound at the dog. Duke thumped his tail once and didn't move. Then George's eye landed on the top photograph and something in his weathered face went quiet in a particular way, not surprised exactly, but stopped. He held the photo in 2 fingers and was still for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had dropped. Dorothy Pruitt and her wagon. He shook his head slowly. I'll be damned. I thought the county scrapped this thing years ago. Patricia watched his face. Tell me about her. So he did. Standing in the cold with the photograph in his hand while she listened. The way she'd spent 30 years listening to other people. Except this time it didn't feel like service. It felt like finally getting something back. The canning factory, George said, had been this town. Nearly everyone's parents had stood on that line at one point or another, filling cans with peaches and beans and sending them out on the railroad that used to run behind the depot. Then 40 winters ago, the company shut the line without warning, 2 weeks before Christmas, and put the entire town out of work in a single afternoon. People talked about hard times like they were a season, he said. That winter, it was a place you lived inside. The bank wouldn't lend. The church pantry ran out in January, and Dorothy Pruitt, who cooked at the diner downtown and didn't have 2 nickels to rub together herself, took her late husband's old camper and cut a window in the side of it and hauled it down to the factory gates where all those laid-off workers were still showing up every morning out of pure habit, standing around a padlocked fence with nowhere else to go. And she fed them, every morning. Hot plate, a quarter, and if you didn't have the quarter she wrote your name in the book and told you to pay her when the factory came back. He handed the photograph back. The factory never came back, she never collected most of it. Fed this town out of that little wagon for the better part of her life. Right up until she got too sick to lift a pan. Then she died and there wasn't anyone to take it on. And after a while, people just quit talking about her. Patricia looked at the trailer, at the bird, at the ledger of forgiven debts sitting on the counter through the open door. How does a town forget something like that? George was quiet for a moment. Same way it forgets anybody, he said. Slow and then all at once. He set the water jugs down on the step. There were people still alive, he told her, who would be dead if not for that woman. He was one of them. His father had pulled him on a sled to that window when he was 6 years old because there was nothing to eat at their house. Dorothy had given him a grilled cheese and told him to slow down or he'd choke. He cleared his throat hard. Anyway, you want a hand with that tarp or not? They spent the morning on the roof. George showed her how to draw the caved corner back into something close to a working shape using a ratchet strap and a length of 2x4, and then they stretched the tarp over the whole top and lashed it down. It was rough work and her hands were bleeding by noon, and she felt more like herself than she had in a very long time. Because once the roof was holding, she couldn't stop. She dragged the rotted cushion out and burned it in a rusted barrel. She scraped the mildew off the walls with a putty knife and the bleach George brought from the salvage yard. And underneath decades of grime, the little galley began to appear. A dented flat-top griddle folded down from beneath the counter, still sound, just dull with neglect, a propane fitting beneath it. When George filled the bottle from a spare in his truck and Patricia struck a match to the burner, the old steel ticked and warmed and threw the smell of heat into the cold morning air. She put both hands flat on the griddle and nearly wept. It worked. Of course it worked, George said. Dorothy built it right. He was working at the plywood over the window with a pry bar. It came away with a shriek of old screws and daylight fell into the trailer for the first time in years. The window frame beneath was intact. When Patricia unlatched it, the panel swung up and out and locked into place as an awning, and the counter below folded down flat exactly as it stood in the photograph. She was looking out through the Bluebird serving window at the empty downtown corner, and for one strange and dizzy moment she could see all of it. The line of men, the sled, the child with the serious eyes. That was when she noticed the girl. Across the street, in the recessed doorway of the shuttered pharmacy, 16 maybe. Close to, taller than she looked at first. Toned down blonde hair pulled into a ponytail that had mostly given up. Eyes the pale green of sea glass. Set in a face that was doing its level best to look like it wasn't watching anything. The hoodie she wore was gray and too thin for the weather. The kind of thin that says this is the warmest thing I own. Not this is what I grabbed on my way out. She had a backpack over one shoulder and the posture of someone who had learned, through specific and unpleasant experience, to stand close to exits. When Patricia looked directly at her, the girl looked away, then made herself look back. That second part, the making herself, took more nerve than the looking away had. You lost, Patricia called through the open window. Not cold, not soft, just a question. No, the chin came up, just watching. It's a free sidewalk. It is. Patricia turned back to the burner, already reaching for the bread George had left, already reaching for the block of cheese in the bag from his truck cab. Butter into the pan, bread into the butter, the hiss and the smell of it. You eating today? The silence on the other side of the street had a particular quality to it, the kind that comes from a person weighing something. Why? Because I'm testing a griddle and I hate to waste food. She pressed the bread flat with the spatula. You'd be doing me a favor. Come sit on the step. The dog doesn't bite. The girl came across the street one careful step at a time, the way someone crosses ice they're not sure about. Up close she was all angles and suspicion, with those bruise-colored shadows under her eyes that Patricia recognized from her own mirror, the ones that aren't from one bad night but from a long chain of them. She sat on the far end of the step, as far from Duke as the geometry allowed. Duke relocated himself immediately and leaned his full weight against her leg, and her hand dropped into his fur before she'd apparently decided to do that. Patricia slid the sandwich through the window on a paper towel. Careful. Hot. The girl ate it in approximately 90 seconds and spent that entire time trying very hard to look like she wasn't particularly hungry. Olivia, she said finally, wiping her mouth on her sleeve. That was as close as she was going to get to thank you, and Patricia understood it perfectly. Patricia, already buttering 2 more slices. The second one hit the griddle with that specific sound, a low sizzle that meant the temperature was exactly right. You go to school. When I feel like it. Olivia was watching the second sandwich with an attention she couldn't entirely conceal. My mom works nights over in the next county. She's gone before I get up. Gets home after I'm asleep. She said it flat. A set of facts daring Patricia to turn them into something pitiable. Patricia did not turn them into something pitiable. She flipped the sandwich, let it get the color it needed, and pushed it through the window with the same matter-of-fact steadiness she'd used on lunch trays for 22 years. Then you know where I am, she said. I'm going to be right here. She had no idea, saying it, how she was going to keep that promise. She only knew, watching the girl eat and the dog lean and the steam rise off the griddle into the cold air, that she meant it all the way down to whatever was left of her after the last 2 years. They were still there, the 3 of them. The step, the warmth of the open window when the white sedan pulled up, town seal on the door. The man who climbed out was in his 30s, carrying a clipboard with the apologetic urgency of someone sent to do something he'd rather not. He looked at the trailer, at the open serving window, at the woman inside and the girl on the step and the dog between them. He sighed before he'd even crossed the lot. Ma'am, are you the owner of this? He checked the clipboard. This vehicle. Bought it at the county auction on Saturday. I have the receipt. Patricia touched the front of her coat where the yellow slip was folded. Right, yes. The thing is, this corner is town property. And even if it weren't, you can't operate. Is that a food setup? You can't run a food operation without a permit, an inspection, any of that. and there's a notice I'm required to give you." He peeled a printed sheet from the clipboard and held it through the window. "I'm sorry, I really am, I just get sent." Patricia took the notice and read it standing at her own serving window, bright orange across the top. "Notice to remove unpermitted structure. Town lot, 30 days. She got to the bottom and the cold moved through her in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This parcel is under contract for redevelopment. Callum Development Group, Reed Development." She said it carefully. "This lot has been weeds since before either of us was born. That's sort of the point, I think." The man actually looked embarrassed on behalf of the situation. "They're putting in a shopping plaza, grocery, pharmacy, some retail, parking jobs, they're saying. The council is excited about it." He gestured at the notice, already backing toward his car. "Mr. Callum is from here, actually. Grew up here, went out and made money, wants to fix up the old downtown. Everybody thinks it's a good thing." A pause. "And it's part of it, the anchor of it, apparently." He looked at the bird, at the window, at Olivia on the step. "It's a nice little whatever it is." 30 days, ma'am. I am sorry." He drove away. Olivia watched him go with the flat expression of a kid who had seen a certain number of official vehicles arrive to take things away. "They're going to tow it," she said. "Maybe." Patricia set the orange notice on the counter, face down, next to Dorothy's letter. "People keep telling me to get rid of this trailer. My son, the county, now the mayor." She looked at the bird, the window folded down the way it had been in the photograph, the griddle still warm. "I'm getting tired of being told what to throw away." That evening, after Olivia had gone home to an empty house and Duke was asleep with his chin on his own front paws, Patricia sat with the tin again. She read Dorothy's letter a third time. It ended in the same unfinished place, "hand tired, light going. Come back tomorrow." She wanted the rest of it. She wanted to know what Dorothy had been too exhausted to say. She lifted the stack of index cards out of the tin to look beneath them and felt it. Under the cards, flat against the bottom, was a second sheet of paper folded small and stiff. Folded as if it had been carried in a pocket for a long time before being put here. And inside that folding, a stiffer thing still. A document on heavy stock. She could feel the raised edge of a county seal with her thumb before she ever turned it over. She opened the second page of the letter first, because Dorothy had meant it to come first, and the shaky handwriting picked up without pause, as if no night had passed at all. "Now here is the part I did not have the strength to write last night. This corner where I always parked, the old depot corner. I didn't just sit here all those years. In 1979, I bought it, paid cash, a little at a time, out of quarters. The deed is folded behind this page and it is recorded down at the county. Whatever anybody tells you. I never built on it because the wagon was all the building this town needed. I am leaving the corner and the bluebird together to whoever brings her back to life and keeps the griddle warm for anybody who is short this week. That is the only condition. Feed people and it is yours. Stop feeding them and it belongs to the next hungry soul who will. They will try to take it. Don't let them. Feed people and you cannot lose." Patricia's hands went completely still. She unfolded the heavy document behind the letter, a county deed, the legal description of one corner lot at the end of the old Main Street in Mill Haven, Ohio, and on the line where the owner went, typed in fading ink, a name, Dorothy Pruitt, and beneath it in that same trembling hand the last line Dorothy Pruitt ever wrote. "They will try to take it. Don't let them." Patricia did not sleep much that night, but for a better reason than the night before. She lay on the bare bench with the deed held against her chest, and Duke breathing warm against her back, and by the time the sky above the depot shifted from black to gray, she had settled on the only plan that made any sense. She would do exactly what the letter said. She would feed people. And she would find out what a 50-year-old deed and a dead woman's last instruction were worth against a bright orange notice and the name of a development group. Angela Ferris worked out of a county legal aid office wedged between a bail bondsman and a dry cleaner on the second floor of a building that smelled permanently of someone else's lunch. The waiting room held 6 plastic chairs, a rubber plant that had been dead for 2 years but hadn't been removed yet. And on the morning Patricia walked in, 4 other people ahead of her, each one holding a document the way people hold things they're afraid of, but can't put down. Patricia was the 5th. She had the deed in her coat pocket and Dorothy's letters in the Folgers tin, which she carried the same way she'd carried it on George's flatbed, like a passenger, like something with a pulse. Angela Ferris turned out to be 34, maybe 35. Dark hair cut short in the way of someone who had decided years ago that she didn't have time for it. Reading glasses pushed up on her forehead even though she wasn't reading anything. The kind of woman who moved through a room like she was already halfway through the next thought. She read Dorothy's letter once, then again. Then she set it down and pulled the deed toward her and read that twice without speaking. The office around her hummed the dry cleaner's equipment through the shared wall. Someone arguing quietly in the waiting room about a landlord. Angela was somewhere else entirely. The good news. She finally set everything down and folded her hands on the desk. The deed is real. I pulled the parcel record while you were in the waiting room. Dorothy Pruitt owned that corner free and clear, and this letter reads like a valid holographic will, which Ohio recognizes. She picked up her pen and then set it back down. The bad news has a name. Patricia waited. Tax lien. Angela turned her monitor around. A holding company, address tracing back downtown. When Dorothy died, no family stepped forward. The estate never went through probate. The lot just sat there while property taxes accumulated year after year. Small amounts. Nobody watching. Eventually the county did what counties do it, placed a lien on the parcel and sold that lien to recover the money. Whoever holds the lien can move to foreclose and take the corner unless the debt is paid or the sale is challenged. Patricia already knew the name before she asked who had bought it. She could feel the shape of the answer the way you can feel the shape of a room in the dark before your eyes adjust. Angela turned the screen. A holding company, a registered address, and behind the holding company, traced through one more layer of incorporation, a development group, Callum. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Out in the waiting room, a baby had started crying and someone was explaining something about a water shutoff to the clerk at the front desk. So he's not just going to demolish it, Patricia said slowly. He's going to foreclose on it, take the corner out from under a dead woman for a few years of unpaid taxes. That's the plan I'd draw up if I were his attorney. Foreclose quiet and fast before anyone with a legitimate claim wakes up and files anything. Angela leaned back. But you woke up, and you have the original deed and the will, which nobody expected to exist. That changes the math considerably. She paused. We could file to open Dorothy's estate. Name you as the beneficiary under her stated conditions. Contest the foreclosure on the grounds that the county never notified the rightful heir, because the county never knew there was one. Would it work? It buys time, it might buy everything. It also costs money you don't have and means standing in front of this town's council and this town's favorite son and saying no out loud. Angela looked at her directly. Are you the kind of woman who can do that? Patricia thought about 22 years behind a serving line. About a printed letter with no signature. About a checking account that couldn't cover groceries. About standing at an auction with $9 and everyone in earshot laughing and not turning around. I've spent my whole life being the woman nobody had to argue with, she said. Let's find out what the other kind feels like. She couldn't pay the filing fee that week, so she did the only part of the plan that was free. She fed people. It started the way most things that matter start, quietly, without announcement, without any sense that it was the beginning of something. Olivia came the next morning before school, and Patricia put eggs on the griddle and made an extra sandwich that went into the side pocket of the backpack without discussion. George came at noon and brought Donald Hatch from the hardware store across the street, a man in his early 60s with a gray beard and reading glasses permanently attached to the front of his flannel shirt, who had apparently heard there was a woman cooking out of Dorothy Pruitt's old wagon and did not believe it. Donald stood at the serving window and looked at the painted bird for a long time. His whole body had gone still in the way that happens when something touches a memory you'd stopped expecting to find. My grandmother ate here. He said it carefully, like setting down something that might break during the bad winter. She used to tell me about the bluebird lady, said the woman never once made her feel ashamed for needing it. He put a $5 bill on the counter and refused the change. Whatever you're making, put the rest toward the next person who's short. Patricia wrote his name in the back of Dorothy's ledger. Beside it, $5. Beside that, a single word, forward. The first new line in that book in a very long time. By the end of the week, there was a coffee can on the counter with a slot cut in the lid and a hand-lettered board propped where anyone waiting could read it. She had found Dorothy's original in the ledger and copied it out by hand. The same words, the same logic. Unchanged by 40 years because it turned out the logic was still correct. Hot plate. Pay what you can. If you're short this week, eat anyway. They old ones came first, the ones who remembered shuffling down from the senior apartment building 2 blocks up, pulling folding chairs from the backs of their cars and setting them on the cracked asphalt, arguing about whether Dorothy's chili had ever had beans in it, and whether that was a feature or a flaw. George brought more chairs from the salvage yard without being asked. Then the night shift people started stopping on their way home. Nurses. The woman who worked the register at the gas station out on Route 9. The 3 men who drove the county snowplows and were always awake at hours when the rest of the town was not. Patricia learned their schedules and had coffee going when they pulled up, which meant they started pulling up on purpose. The woman who ran the regional food bank drove 40 minutes to see what was happening and left behind 3 cases of canned goods and her cell number. Standing at the window in a down vest and pragmatic shoes, she looked at the coffee can and the ledger and the line of 7 people waiting in the cold and said what Patricia had been thinking but hadn't said aloud yet. "You're doing in a parking lot what I can barely manage in a warehouse with a federal grant. How are you paying for any of this?" "I'm mostly not," Patricia told her. "That's sort of the point." Big man, 50 or so. The kind of person whose face was set by default into an expression that said he wasn't asking for help and wasn't interested in offers. He stood at the window on a Tuesday with his jaw set and told Patricia flat that he didn't take charity. Good. She didn't look up from the griddle. "I don't run a charity. This is a lunch counter. $3 a plate if you've got it." He put down $3 he clearly needed. He ate standing up, quickly, without conversation or eye contact. But he came back the next day, and the day after. And at the end of a bad week when his wallet was empty, he stood at the window in the kind of silence that costs a proud person something, and Patricia wrote his name in the back of the ledger without commentary, a small number beside it, the word 4 forward. He didn't look ashamed walking away, because a debt written in a book was a commitment, and a commitment was something a person could carry out the door without having to fold himself up to do it. She was not getting rich. Some days the can held $40 and some days it held 4. More than once she cooked her own supper from what was left because she'd given the rest away. But she wasn't hungry, and for the first time in 2 years she woke up in the morning with somewhere she had to be, and people who would notice if she wasn't there. Olivia had appointed herself the Bluebird's second pair of hands without any formal conversation about it. She showed up after school and washed the flat top and refilled the napkin holder and learned, without being taught, to read the line the way a good server reads it. She could spot, within 30 seconds, which customer wanted to be left alone, and which kid at the end of the line needed a second plate and would never ask for one. One evening Olivia attempted a batch of grilled cheese without asking first. The first one came off the griddle the color of a coal seam. She stared at it. Patricia looked at it. "Don't panic, I'm not panicking." A pause. "It's just very black. My first one was worse." "How much worse?" "I set off the smoke alarm in a commercial kitchen. There were 40 children involved." Patricia took the spatula from her, scraped the evidence into the trash, and handed it back. Again. The second one came out perfect. Olivia slid it onto a paper towel, with the careful pride of someone who had just cleared a hurdle they hadn't told anyone they were worried about. Donald Hatch was sitting at the nearest picnic table and had watched the whole sequence with the expression of a man being gently entertained. He ate the sandwich, left $2 extra on the table when he went. "Entertainment fee," he said. Deadpan. "Place could use a menu item called the second attempt. Charge extra for character." The laugh that came out of Olivia was short and genuine and clearly surprised her. She pressed her lips together immediately after, but it had already happened, and Patricia filed it away carefully, the way you file away something rare. "You notice people," Patricia told her later. "The 2 of them scraping the griddle down in the dark, shoulders almost touching in the small space. That's the whole job. Most people can't do it. They're too busy waiting for their turn to speak. It's just handing people food. It's knowing what someone needs before they figure it out themselves. You've been doing that your whole life. You just never had a window to do it through." Olivia scrubbed at a stubborn spot on the steel and didn't answer, but her shoulders came down about half an inch, which was more than a shrug and less than agreement and exactly what it needed to be. The second notice arrived on a Friday morning, not apologetic this time. No man in a fleece vest. It was taped to the serving window when Patricia returned from the water spigot at the corner of the depot lot. And it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, because the language was different from the first notice, more formal, more certain, with the weight of something that had already been decided rather than something being proposed. The county seal and the town seal both. The heft of institutions that have made up their mind. The town council had voted to declare the corner surplus and convey it to satisfy the outstanding lien. A foreclosure sale had been scheduled, and at the bottom, in a font that didn't apologize for itself, a date 11 days out, a time in the morning, and a line that told her everything she needed to know about how much time she actually had. On that date, the structure known as the Bluebird will be removed from the parcel by a licensed contractor, and the parcel transferred to Callum Development Group. Duke leaned against her leg while she read it, and read it again, and a third time, slowly, the way she'd read Dorothy's letter and the deed, as if going slower might change what the words meant. It didn't. 11 days, a deed, a letter, and a lawyer who said it might be worth everything or nothing. A coffee can of small bills. A town that had just remembered it used to have a heart standing between her and the morning they would come to take it all away. She didn't spend those 11 days being afraid. She didn't have time. She spent them cooking, and something strange was happening. The more the town understood it was about to lose the Bluebird, the more people came to stand in line for it. Word moved the way it always moves in small towns, not like water, which spreads evenly, but like a crack in ice, following the lines of least resistance until suddenly everything on either side of it is separated. By Tuesday of the second week, the line at the serving window stretched to the sidewalk before Patricia had finished her morning setup. By Thursday it wrapped around toward the depot wall. The filing fee arrived on the second day. Patricia came back from the water spigot to find the coffee can heavier than it had any right to be, and a folded note on top in Donald Hatch's blocky capital letters. For the lawyer, from the old gate crowd. Inside, small bills, rolled coins, $41 and some change, exactly enough. She stood at the window where no one could see her face except Duke, and she let it happen, the thing she'd been holding back for 3 weeks, and Duke put his head on her knee and waited, patient as ever, for her to finish. Angela filed the next morning, opened Dorothy Prith's estate, named Patricia as beneficiary under the terms of the letter, filed to stop the foreclosure on the grounds that the county had never notified the rightful heir, because the county had never known there was one. This slows them down. Angela told her over the phone. Doesn't stop them. They can still argue the will's invalid, the deed's stale, all of it. But here's what they didn't count on. A pause, not for effect but because she was actually thinking. This is on the record now, it's in the paper, and this town is watching. Callum built his entire public story on being the man who came home to save this place. It is substantially harder to bulldoze a beloved dead woman's charitable operation in front of an audience than it is to do it quietly in a county clerk's office on a Tuesday afternoon. Pamela Voss had found the Bluebird in the third week. She covered 3 towns with 1 camera and 1 notebook, and the focused energy of someone who had been doing this long enough to recognize when a story was actually a story. She stood at the serving window while Patricia flipped grilled cheese and told her everything, Dorothy and the factory and the $9 and the bird, and Pamela took notes without interrupting, which was the best interview Patricia had ever given. The story ran that Sunday under a photograph of the Bluebird with its window down and 7 people waiting in line and the painted bird visible above the counter. The headline said, "She spent her last 9, and the town got its heart back." Patricia cut it out and put it in the back of the ledger. She didn't know yet that the same Sunday paper had landed on a great many kitchen tables, and that some of the people reading it were not glad. Richard came on a Tuesday. She knew his car before he was out of it. The large silver thing he'd bought himself the year the marriage ended. She felt the old reflex move through her chest, the automatic bracing, the internal adjustment, the particular kind of tired that came from years of managing a man's moods before they became her problem. She felt it. And then, with a surprise that was almost physical, she felt it pass. Richard Holloway at 57 was exactly as she remembered him, and somehow exactly as he'd always been, silver hair that cost money to keep that way, a coat that was the right weight for the season, the posture of a man who had never in his adult life been uncertain about where he was going when he walked into a room. He looked at the trailer and the bird and the folding chairs and the coffee can, with the expression he used for things he'd decided were beneath him. Patricia, my God. It's worse than Kevin described. Hello, Richard? Would you like a plate? Pay what you can for you, I'll make an exception and charge full price. He didn't laugh. He never had. I came to make you an offer, a real one. $12,000, cash this week. You sign a document walking away from this corner, and whatever claim you think you have to it, and you take the money and find yourself an apartment somewhere, and start over where nobody knows about all of this. The amount landed with a specific gravity. 6 weeks ago, $12,000 would have been a different life, a real one. A door that opened instead of one that said insufficient funds and looked away. How do you know I have a claim to this corner? Something moved across his face. Quick, there and gone. It's a small town. No. She came around to the window and rested her forearms on the counter. Not aggressive. Just steady. Steady was something she'd had to practice. The deed is a week old to everyone but me and one lawyer. The town thinks I'm squatting. But you came here with a number and a document for me to sign. Which means somebody who is counting on taking this corner told you about the woman standing in the way. She watched his face do the thing it did when a conversation wasn't going the direction he'd planned. How much of Kasim's development group are you in, Richard? And don't tell me it's small. His jaw tightened. That was the whole answer. It's a good investment, he said. It's going to bring jobs. It's going to save this town, which is more than a grilled cheese is going to accomplish. And yes, I put money in, and I would rather that money not get tied up for 2 years in a legal fight, because my ex-wife wants to play house in a dead woman's lunch wagon. The envelope came out of his coat pocket and landed on the counter, with the flat certainty of something he'd been practicing on the drive over. 12,000. Don't be stupid about this. You've been stupid enough for one lifetime. Patricia looked at the envelope. She thought about the motel room, about the checkout notice under the door, about the Folgers can with her mother's handwriting inside it, which she had fought to keep not because it was worth anything, but because it was the only proof she had that someone had once cooked with love and meant it. She picked up the envelope. She turned it over in her hands once, feeling the weight of what was inside, and then she placed it back in Richard's hand and folded his fingers around it slowly, the way you'd close someone's fist around something they needed to hold on to. Keep it, she said. I know exactly what your money is worth. I've been living on the nothing you left me for 2 years. She stepped back from the window. The Bluebird isn't for sale. Neither am I. Not anymore. Richard left the way he'd arrived, fast and without looking at the people in the folding chairs, who had heard every word through the serving window and were watching him go with the patient. Flat-eyed composure of people who had outlasted worse men than him. When his car disappeared around the corner, Donald Hatch got up from his chair, dropped $1 into the can that he didn't owe, and said to nobody in particular, "Bring me a coffee, Patricia. I want to sit here a while." She understood that he wasn't thirsty. He was standing guard. Kevin came the next day. He stood where his father had stood but couldn't hold the same face, because he was 26 and he had loved her once without complication and still did, in the way that children love parents, even when they've been taught to disapprove of them. He looked at the bird and the ledger and the hand-lettered board, and she could see him trying to reconcile the mother he'd been embarrassed by with the woman who had been on the front page of the county paper 3 days ago. "Mom, please, just take the money," Dad says Lang Callum. "Whoever has the whole council, the vote's already decided. They are going to tow this thing and you are going to have nothing again. Except this time it'll be in the paper when it happens." His voice cracked on the last word, and Patricia understood that underneath the embarrassment he was frightened for her, and that frightened him more than the embarrassment did, and that neither of them knew yet what to do with that. "Sit down, Kevin," she said. "Let me feed you. You haven't let me feed you since you were 17. He sat at the far end of the step, the same spot Olivia always took, and Patricia made him grilled cheese the way he'd liked it as a kid, cut on the diagonal, and pushed it through the window. And for a few minutes her grown son ate his mother's cooking on a curb in the middle of downtown and didn't say a word about how it looked. Olivia came around the corner with her backpack, stopped when she saw the stranger on the step and held, ready to bolt. "It's all right," Patricia said through the window. "This is my son Kevin. Kevin, this is Olivia. She runs the place when I'm not looking." Olivia processed this. Then she went to the sink and took up her position without ceremony. Kevin watched how she moved around the small space, the ease of it. The belonging, and Patricia watched something old and certain about who his mother was shift slightly in her son's expression. Later, after Kevin had gone, Olivia said without looking up from the griddle, "He thinks I'm something you rescued. He thinks a lot of things his father taught him to think." Patricia handed her a clean cloth. "You're not something I rescued. You're someone nobody fed properly. There's a difference, and one day you'll feel it in your bones instead of just hearing someone say it." Olivia scrubbed the steel without answering. But she stayed an hour past dark, and when she finally left, she took a wrapped sandwich for morning without being told to, which was its own kind of answer. The week that followed had a quality Patricia would later have trouble describing. Not peace exactly. More like the particular calm of someone who is committed to a direction and is moving toward it with whatever they have, which in her case was still not very much, but was more than it had been. The griddle was warm. The can was filling and emptying and filling again. The old gate crowd had stopped coming just to eat and had started coming to witness, which was a different and more powerful thing. Folding chairs arranged like a jury, gray heads and coffee cups. The particular gravity of people who have been somewhere long enough to understand what it means when something is about to be lost. Thomas Greer started showing up earlier than his lunch plate required. He stood at the edge of things for a few days, hands in his pockets, watching the line without appearing to watch it. Then one morning he picked up a stack of folding chairs that someone had left in a pile and set them out without being asked. And after that it was just understood that he did that now. Sharon Beckett from the food bank came back twice more, each time with more supplies and fewer questions, which Patricia took to mean she'd stopped wondering whether this was going to last, and started treating it like something to invest in. The retired schoolteacher who lived above the pharmacy, a small, precise woman named Cynthia, who wore her white hair cut close and her opinions even closer, circulated a petition and filled 4 pages in an afternoon. Someone nailed a hand-painted sign to the dead streetlight pole that said "Save the Bluebird" in greenhouse paint, and nobody took it down. Not even the man from the town office who drove past it twice. The night the foreclosure date was formally set, a dozen people stayed after the griddle went cold. They sat at the picnic tables George had dragged over from the salvage yard and held what amounted to a council of war. Mostly sold. One teenage girl with a grilled cheese burn on her left wrist from the previous week that she refused to acknowledge. One man with a salvage yard. The plan they settled on was the only plan they had. On the morning the trucks came, they would be there first. They would stand between the tow rig and the trailer, and they would not raise a hand or a voice, and they would make this town's beloved son crush its own heart in front of every camera he could not keep away. The whole cost of the calculation, visible to everyone, including the people who'd be writing about it on Sunday. "They'll arrest us," Cynthia said evenly, not afraid, just noting the variable. The oldest man at the table, in his late 80s, still driving himself, still wearing the cap from the canning factory that had gone soft with 40 years of washing, looked at her over his coffee cup. He'd eaten at Dorothy's window as a child. He had come back every day since Patricia opened hers. "I've been removed from better sidewalks than this one," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has served enough unnichtings to have calibrated what matters. My legs held then. It was not a rousing speech. Nobody cheered. They just nodded and finished their coffee and went home to be up early. Pamela Voss called Patricia the night before the trucks were scheduled. She'd been pulling on threads, she said. The way she said it was careful and methodical, like she was choosing each word to make sure it went exactly where she aimed it. Callum's development ran on silent money. Investors who stayed out of the public record by design. The lien on Dorothy's corner had been purchased by a holding company, and behind the holding company, layered under one more incorporation, was a limited partnership. One of the men who had put money into that partnership had done so approximately 18 months ago. His name was Richard Holloway. Pamela's voice stayed even the whole time she said it. A pause. "Your divorce was about 18 months ago, wasn't it?" Patricia sat down on the step. Duke settled against her leg. It was. Because if he swore in those proceedings that he didn't have money that he in fact had, and then turned around and invested that same money in the weeks after, that's not just ugly. That's fraud on the court. And on you. Another pause. "Shorter this time. I'm running the story Sunday either way. But I thought you'd want to know before the tow truck shows up in the morning." Patricia didn't sleep that night. She sat with Dorothy's ledger open across her knees and read the forgiven names by worklight until the sky above the old depot shifted from black to gray. She read them slowly, each one, the smalls amounts and the reasons beside the crossed-out numbers. Paid in canned corn. Forget it. God rest him. Forget it. A whole accounting of what a person could choose to release. She thought about Richard. About 28 years of signing things she didn't read carefully enough. Trusting a man across a table, because she had genuinely believed that trust was a foundation, rather than a position you could be maneuvered out of. She thought about the checking account that wouldn't cover groceries, about the printed letter from the school district with no signature, about standing at an auction in a coat that was 2 winters old and hearing a room full of people laugh. And she thought about Dorothy, who had been too tired to finish her letter, but had still found the energy to hide a deed in a bench seat and seal it in oilcloth and leave it for whoever came next, who had bought a corner lot a quarter at a time, out of what she made feeding people who had nothing, and then written it all down in a shaky hand and trusted that the world would eventually produce someone worth leaving it to. The first engine sound reached the depot corner while the sky was still more gray than blue. A truck, then another, coming from the direction of the town garage. Patricia folded the ledger closed, stood up, went to the griddle. Because whatever else happened in the next hour, people were going to get fed. That was the one part of the plan that didn't depend on lawyers or deeds or the goodwill of councils. That part was just hers, had always been hers, probably always would be. The butter hit the hot steel, and the sound of it filled the trailer and spilled out through the serving window into the cold morning air. And she stood at the burner and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, that she was standing in exactly the right place. So let me ask you something. If you found out that the person trying to take the last thing you had was the exact same person who had already taken everything else, what would you do? Because what Patricia did next is the part nobody in that town was ready to see. Word count, 3,487 target not met, continuing to reach 7,500. The morning before the trucks came, Patricia had done one other thing. She had gone back to the ledger, not to read it this time, to add to it. She took the pen she kept by the register and opened to the last blank page in the back and wrote the only name that mattered right then. Dorothy Pruitt, 40 years, the whole corner, everything. She wrote beside it, not a debt, a gift, and beside that, paid forward every day. She closed the ledger and set it exactly where it had been and turned back to the griddle, and the butter was just starting to brown at the edges the way it needed to. What nobody watching from the outside could have known, what didn't make it into Pamela's story. Because some things happen in the quiet of 3 a.m. and don't get witnessed, was that the week before the trucks came, Patricia had reached a particular kind of exhaustion that wasn't physical. It was the kind that sets in when you have been holding something up for long enough that you've forgotten you're doing it, and then your arms remind you all at once. She'd had 2 nights where she lay on the bench with the deed against her chest and couldn't stop the math. The math that said Angela was one lawyer in a county legal aid office, with 40 active cases and a rubber plant she'd given up on. That said Callum had attorneys who went to the kind of firm where the coffee was better than Patricia's entire monthly food budget. That said 11 days was not a long time, and a holographic will written by a woman who had been dead long enough for her name to be forgotten might not hold up against the institutional weight of a foreclosure that had already been scheduled and voted on and signed. Those 2 nights she didn't sleep. But she also didn't change the plan. Because there was something Dorothy had understood and written down in a shaky hand that Patricia had read so many times by worklight it had become part of her. Feed people and you cannot lose. Not you will win. Not the deed will hold. Just, you cannot lose. As if the feeding itself was the point and everything else was secondary, including the outcome. That was either the most naive thing she'd ever heard or the most sophisticated, and she'd spent the better part of 3 weeks trying to figure out which one it was. And she still wasn't sure. And she had decided that not being sure was all right. You could act on something you weren't certain of. She'd been doing it since she spent her last $9. Olivia had picked up on the tension the way she picked up on everything, not by asking about it, but by adjusting. She started coming earlier. She stocked things before they ran out instead of after, which was a form of thinking ahead that takes a while to develop in someone her age, and which Patricia noticed and said nothing about, because saying something would have embarrassed both of them. She started staying later, too. After the dinner crowd, such as it was, the corner didn't really have a dinner crowd yet, but there were people who came in the early evening, the ones who worked days and lived alone and needed somewhere that was warm, and not a bar. Olivia would sit at one of the picnic tables with her homework and do it there. Under the awning George had rigged from a tarp and 2 salvaged 2x4s. One night, Patricia looked out the serving window and saw Olivia at the table doing what looked like a math worksheet, and sitting 2 tables down was Thomas Greer eating a bowl of the tomato soup Patricia had made from Sharon's donated canned goods. And they were not talking to each other, but they were sharing the same space in a way that felt like something. Like the beginning of a particular kind of community. The kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to. Olivia's mother had come to the window once, near the end of the 2nd week. A woman in her late 30s in scrubs from a night shift. Tired in the specific way of someone who has been tired for long enough that they've stopped noticing it as a separate condition. She'd stood at the window and looked at Patricia and then at the griddle and then at the hand-lettered board, and she'd said, "Olivia comes here every day. She does. She's been doing her homework. Every night." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the board again. At the line that said, "If you're short this week, eat anyway." Something in her face moved in a way she didn't entirely manage to control. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Patricia said. "That's what the board says. The board says pay what you can, and I can tell what you can is everything you've got right now." So, she was already reaching for bread. "Let me make you a plate. Tell me how you take your coffee." The woman's name was Linda, and she ate standing at the window because she was too tired to climb the step, and she drank her coffee black, and she didn't say much after that. But she left a 5 in the can before she went, and she came back the next evening and the one after that. And gradually the hour she arrived started getting slightly earlier, which meant she was leaving work slightly earlier, and Patricia suspected that the Bluebird had something to do with that, even if she could never have proved it. The day before the trucks were due, Donald Hatch did something Patricia wouldn't find out about until later. He went to every member of the old gate crowd, the ones who remembered Dorothy's window, the ones who had been eating at this corner every day since Patricia opened it, and he told them what time the trucks were coming in the morning. He didn't tell them what to do. He just told them the time and the address, as if they didn't already know the address, as if they hadn't been sitting on that cracked asphalt every day for 3 weeks. He figured they'd draw their own conclusions. They did. Meanwhile, Angela Ferris was doing the thing lawyers do when they're underpaid and overworked, and also, occasionally, genuinely angry about something. She was making calls. She had found a contact at the county clerk's office, a woman named Brenda Wills who had worked the records room for 30 years, and had a memory for property filings that bordered on the photographic, who confirmed that Dorothy's deed was recorded exactly where Dorothy's letter said it would be. She had found a property law professor at Ohio State who was willing to look at the holographic will language and give a preliminary opinion, which was that the will was probably valid, and the conditions attached to it were unusual but not unenforceable. Probably unusual but not unenforceable. This was the legal equivalent of encouraging news. Angela also called the county folklore officer, which was a conversation that went in the direction Angela had expected, politely, firmly, in the direction of it's already been scheduled and we don't have discretion at this stage, but which had the benefit of creating a paper trail, showing that the heir had made herself known and been acknowledged. Pamela Voss, for her part, had spent those same days pulling threads. What she found at the end of the threads was Richard. She found it the way good reporters find things that have been deliberately obscured, not by accident, not by luck, but by patience and the willingness to follow one more incorporation record, one more registered agent, one more address that turned out to lead to another address that turned out to lead to a name. Richard Holloway, 18 months ago, in a limited partnership that had bought a lien on a corner lot in Millhaven, Ohio, from the county, 18 months ago, which was the same period of time in which Richard had sworn, under oath in the divorce proceedings, that he did not have significant liquid assets, which meant either that he had found the money after the proceedings concluded, which was possible, or that the money had existed during the proceedings and had been hidden, which was fraud. Pamela had the documentation. She had the timeline. She had the recordings of 3 separate conversations she'd had with people tangentially connected to the project who had, without quite meaning to, confirmed the structure of the investment. She had a story, a real one, the kind that doesn't just explain a situation but changes it. She called Patricia the night before the trucks came, because she believed the woman deserved to know what was in the paper before the paper appeared. And Patricia sat with that information on the step of the trailer she'd bought for $9. With the dog leaning against her and the streetlight dead overhead and the work light inside, throwing its yellow glow out through the serving window, and she thought about it for a long time. She thought about the 28 years, the house in his name, the savings in his name, the printed letter with no signature. She thought about the divorce and signing things she hadn't read carefully enough, and trusting a man across a table because that was what she had always done with him, out of habit and history, and the particular exhaustion of a long marriage in which one person does most of the work. And she thought about the envelope on the counter. $12,000 he'd offered her to walk away, which he hadn't offered out of generosity. He'd offered it because the alternative, her staying, her fighting, her turning out to have a deed and a lawyer and a town standing in folding chairs behind her, was going to cost him more. He'd done the math the way he always did the math, and $12,000 was the cost of making a problem disappear before it got expensive. She had declined to disappear. Now it was going to get expensive. She didn't feel triumphant about this. She wasn't sure what she felt. Something quieter than triumph and more durable. Something that had to do with the difference between winning and simply refusing to be moved. The griddle ticked as it cooled. Duke breathed slow and even. Somewhere down the street a car passed and its headlights swept briefly across the wall of the depot and were gone. The hand-lettered board caught a slice of light for a moment. Feed people first. The books can wait. Patricia went inside. She set up for morning bread, butter, eggs, the coffee can filled with grounds, everything in its place. She checked the propane. She wiped the counter down one more time, which it didn't need, but which was what she did when her hands needed something to do. Then she lay down on the bench with the coat over her, and the deed under her hand and the dog a warm solid weight against her back, and waited for morning, which came as mornings do, regardless. The trucks came at 8:12, not 8 on the dot, which was what the notice had said, but 8:12, which meant someone had been delayed or reconsidered, or maybe just sat in their cab for 12 minutes looking at what was waiting for them at the end of the street. Patricia heard the engines before she saw the headlights. The flat top was already hot. She had coffee going in 2 carafes and a stack of bread on the counter, and butter softening at room temperature because this morning, whatever else happened, people were going to eat. The first thing the tow driver saw when he turned onto the depot corner was not the trailer. It was the people, 40 of them, maybe more, spread across the lot in that particular loose formation. That happens when a crowd has organized itself without a leader, not a line, not a block, but a presence. The old gate crowd in their folding chairs pulled up to standing. Thomas Greer near the back with both hands in his pockets and his jaw set and his eyes absolutely steady on the lead truck. Cynthia, the retired schoolteacher, holding her petition clipboard against her chest. Sharon Beckett from the food bank in her down vest, arms crossed. Donald Hatch from the hardware store. The nurses who came in the pre-dawn hours. The snowplow drivers. The man who'd eaten at Dorothy's window as a child and was now in his late 80s. And leaning on a cane that he held like it was a point he intended to make, and Olivia, standings next to George with her chin up and her jaw out, and the grey hoodie replaced today for the first time Patricia had seen by a green one that actually fit, slightly too large but intentionally so. The kind of upgrade that says someone is paying attention to themselves without quite admitting it. George had his arms crossed. His expression said that he had hauled a lot of things in his life that he hadn't agreed with, and today was not going to be one of them. The tow driver climbed down from his cab and stood there and looked at what was between him and Lot 41. He was local. Patricia recognized him. He'd come to the window on a Tuesday and a Friday and had paid both times and tipped once. He looked at the folding chairs and the coffee cups and the white heads and Olivia's green hoodie and said it to nobody specific and everybody present. "I'm not real comfortable with this." "George, then don't do it." The driver looked at the trailer, at the bird, at the serving window where Patricia stood with the griddle behind her and butter going on the flat top and 2 carafes of coffee. He rubbed the back of his neck and got back into his cab without starting the engine. Stephen Callum got out of the dark car, mid-40s. Good coat, the kind of tweed that has real weight to it, not the kind that just looks like it does. Hair brown going silver at the temples in the specific way that reads, in certain zip codes, as distinguished. He had the face of a man who had spent 20 years being told yes and had consequently lost tone required to prepare for no. He walked toward the crowd with his hands spread, palms out, doing the thing people do when they want to look reasonable. "Folks, come on now." His voice was warm, practiced, the kind of warm that could fill a town hall meeting and make everyone in it feel personally addressed. "I know how this looks. I grew up 2 streets from here. I want the same thing you want, which is for this downtown to still be here in 10 years. I'm putting in a grocery store, a pharmacy, so your grandmothers don't have to drive 40 minutes for a prescription. This is jobs. This is the future of this town. A beat. I am not the villain here." Silence, the particular silence of 40 people who have decided not to be moved by charm. Then the oldest man in the crowd took 1 step forward on his cane. He wore the soft, faded cap from the canning factory that had closed 40 winters ago. He had eaten at Dorothy's window as a hungry child, and had driven himself here this morning because his legs, as he had stated the night before, still held. "You're foreclosing on Dorothy Pruitt." Callum's warm face did a small recalculation. "I don't know that name, sir, I know." The old man took another step, not fast, not dramatic, just forward, which was enough. "I'm alive because of her. Half the gray heads behind me are alive because of her. She fed this town out of that wagon when the company you want us to thank for our future padlocked the gates and left us to starve 2 weeks before Christmas. She fed us when there was nothing else. And then we let her name get buried while nobody was watching. He stopped, took a breath that was slower than the others. We are not doing that twice, son. Not while I've still got legs to stand here on. Nobody clapped. It was better than clapping. 40 people simply did not move. The mayor was there, off to one side, standing between the crowd he needed to re-elect him and the developer he'd already promised the corner to, wearing the expression of a man who has just realized he miscounted the cards in his hand and cannot put any of them back. That was when Angela Ferris arrived. She was slightly out of breath. The caseload she ran on didn't leave a lot of room for parking, and she'd had to come from the south end of downtown on foot, which she'd done at something approaching a run. She had a leather portfolio under one arm, and behind her, walking with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has 30 years of county records behind her and is not in the habit of being rushed, came Brenda Wills. Brenda was 58, red hair going silver at the roots, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She carried the county plat book the way a person carries something that has actual authority, flat in both hands, level, deliberate. She had worked the records room since before half the people in this crowd had been old enough to vote. And she looked, standing in the morning cold, like someone who had decided this was one of the things her 30 years entitled her to be present for. Angela stopped a few feet from Callum. She opened the portfolio. Pamela Voss was there with her recorder running. Angela timed the next part accordingly. Mr. Callum, before your contractor touches that trailer, there are some things you should know. She pulled a document from the portfolio and held it where Pamela's recorder would pick up every word. First, that corner was never abandoned property. It was purchased and paid for in 1979 by Dorothy Pruitt, and the deed was recorded at the county, which makes the entire foreclosure action defective at its foundation. She nodded to Brenda, who opened the plat book to the page she'd marked and held it up. There in faded ink, in the careful handwriting of a county clerk who had done their job properly 45 years ago, the entry, the corner lot Pruitt, Dorothy M. recorded, exactly where Dorothy's letter had said it would be. Second before she died, Dorothy Pruitt left a valid holographic will specifying that the property passes to whoever restores her wagon and continues feeding this community. That person exists. She's standing at that window. Angela paused for exactly long enough. Third, the county foreclosed without ever notifying the rightful heir, which it was obligated to do, which it failed to do because it didn't know the heir existed, because nobody knew this letter and this deed were hidden in that trailer until 3 weeks ago, when Patricia Holloway spent $9 at a county surplus auction, and a dog showed her where to look. Callum's warm face had begun the process of closing, the way a window closes when the weather changes. This will also be argued in court, not on a sidewalk, it will. And here is the part that won't wait for court. Angela turned not to Callum, but to the crowd, and to Pamela's recorder, and to the mayor standing at the edge of things, pretending to study his shoes. The company that purchased this lien, the company that paid for those trucks this morning, is funded through a limited partnership. One of the members of that partnership made his investment approximately 18 months ago. His name is Richard Holloway. She let it settle. The woman he sent those trucks to remove this morning is his ex-wife. And at the time he made that investment, he was testifying in divorce proceedings that he did not have significant liquid assets. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to, which means the money he used to fund the removal of the last thing Patricia Holloway built was money that should have been divided with her in the first place. The silence changed temperature. Every head in the crowd turned, looking for Richard, and found him. He'd come after all, standing at the far edge of the lot near the dark car in the good coat, with the expression of a man who had just realized that the room he'd walked into was not the room he'd planned for. Every eye landed on him at the same moment, 40 pairs, plus Pamela's recorder, plus the mayor, who was now looking at Richard in a way that suggested a rapid revision of several political calculations. Richard did not run, but he took one step backward, which told the same story. Patricia came out from behind the serving window. She untied her apron as she walked and folded it over her arm. She moved through the crowd, and the crowd opened for her, not because anyone had decided to step back, but because it was simply the direction the situation was leaning. She stopped in front of Richard close enough that no one else was going to hear this part unless they worked at it. "You put the money you hid from me," she said quietly, "into the company you sent these trucks to take the last thing built." His mouth moved. "Patricia, it's business. The timing was I didn't know it was connected to." You came to my window with an envelope and a document for me to sign my claim away. Not angry, something much colder than angry and much more stable. You knew. You did the math, Richard. You always do the math. She looked at him for a moment the way you look at something you've spent a long time trying to understand and have finally completely understood. You spent 30 years counting what you could keep. Every dollar, every asset, every square foot of that house. She stepped back. I've spent 3 weeks counting who I get to feed. I know which math I prefer. She turned her back on him. She had never once done that in 28 years of marriage. It felt like stepping off a ledge and discovering there was ground beneath it after all. She walked back to the Bluebird. Callum watched her go. Then he looked at the crowd, then at the mayor, then at Pamela Voss, who was not pointing the recorder at him but whose hand had not moved. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built a very specific story about himself, the local boy made good, the one who came back, the one who was going to fix what the decades had broken, and he could see with total clarity what that story was about to become instead. In every kitchen and every church and every memory in this place, in every conversation about what happened downtown that Tuesday morning, the man who crushed Dorothy Pruitt's lunch counter with stolen money in front of the people she'd once kept alive. He could do the math too. Callum walked to the tow driver's window and said it clearly enough that people nearby could hear. Shut it down. We're not doing this today. The driver had the engine started before Callum finished the sentence. It was over that quickly. Which was not how it felt. It felt enormous. It felt like a door blowing open in a storm, but the physical reality of it was simply that 2 trucks started their engines and turned around and drove back the direction they'd come from. And the lot was suddenly just the lot again. Cold and cracked and cluttered with folding chairs and people holding paper cups of coffee. Someone said something. Someone else laughed. Not at anything in particular, just the way people laugh when their bodies need to release something. Cynthia's petition clipboard hit her chest with a small thump as she let out a breath. Thomas Greer unclenched his hands. The old man with the cane turned around and started making his way back toward his chair, and the crowd parted for him the way it had parted for Patricia. Not because anyone decided to, but because it was right. Callum came to the serving window. The salesman face was gone. What was underneath it was simpler and younger and, Patricia thought, more honest, a local boy who had gotten a great many things right, and this one badly wrong. I'll release the lien, he said, keeping his voice down. Transfer it back to the county at what I paid. Let the town put this corner in a historic trust so nobody can ever come after it again. Clean, no headlines about what I did or didn't know. Almost a smile. You'd let me have that. Dorothy wrote that the corner belongs to whoever keeps the griddle warm, Patricia said. She didn't write a word about making my enemies grovel. She picked up the spatula. Do the right thing and buy yourself a plate. Pay what you can. He put a folded bill in the can, and it was a large one, and he didn't make anything of it. He stood at the edge of the lot and ate a grilled cheese in the cold, with people who had come to stop him, and he didn't try to work the room or manage the optics, and he ate the whole thing. Which was something. Kevin had watched it all from the back edge of the crowd, stewed near his father at first, in the way of a son who has not yet decided what he is, and then not near his father, and then across the lot from his father. And then Richard was in the dark car, and the dark car was gone and Kevin was still there. He came to the window. His face had the particular look of a person who has just watched something shift their entire understanding of a situation they thought they knew. Not revelation exactly. More like recognition, like seeing something from a new angle and realizing the angle you'd been using before had been chosen for you by someone else. I'm sorry, Mom, his voice caught on the last word, for the phone call, for the basement, for thinking you were the one making things difficult. He looked at his hands. Put me to work. I don't know how to do anything in there, but I can learn. Patricia looked at him for a long moment, her son, 26 years old, standing on the same cracked asphalt where Olivia had first stood in a too-thin hoodie, deciding whether to trust something. Olivia, she said through the window. Olivia looked up from the batter she'd started mixing she'd taken to experimenting, which Patricia encouraged as long as she announced what she was experimenting on before feeding it to anyone. My son is starting today. He starts on dishes. Olivia studied Kevin with the unsentimental appraisal of someone who had been trained by necessity to assess people quickly. You good with your hands, Kevin? I think so. We'll find out. She pointed to the basin. Dishes. Everything from this morning. We're running behind. He rolled up his sleeves and got to it. And that was how Kevin Holloway joined the crew of the Bluebird Not with a conversation or a reconciliation speech, or any of the things that were technically still owed between them, but with a stack of breakfast dishes and a girl who was 16 and had been managing a lunch counter for 3 weeks and had no interest in going easy on him. They fed the whole crowd that morning. Patricia and Olivia and Kevin George running plates to the chairs and Sharon Beckett working the second coffee carafe, while the line stretched down the sidewalk and curved toward the depot wall. 4 burners and the flat top going without pause. The same people who had laughed at a woman spending her last $9 at a county auction, now waiting an hour in the cold to eat from that griddle and shake her hand. Every one of them came to the window. Every one of them paid what they could, which was sometimes a great deal and sometimes the quarters they'd found in their coat pockets, and once, memorably, a $20 bill accompanied by a note that said late and wasn't signed. The woman from the auction, the one who had called the Bluebird, a tetanus shot on wheels, waited her turn like everyone else. When she reached the window, she couldn't quite look at Patricia directly and said, into the general vicinity of the counter, "I said something ugly that day, at the auction. I've thought about it every day since. You fed your son for 6 years through my line and never made my job harder once." Patricia was already plating. One bad morning at an auction doesn't undo that. Eat your lunch. The woman put a 20 in the can and cried into her grilled cheese. Nobody commented on it. By that point in the morning, it would have been hard to throw a stone without hitting someone who had cried into something. The mayor came last because mayors go where the crowd is and wait until the mood is clear before they commit to a position. He stood at the window with the expression of a man who had voted for the wrong side and knew it, and was hoping the combination of showing up and saying nothing specific might begin to address it. Patricia handed him a plate before he found the words. "Pay what you can," she told him. Same as everyone. He put $40 in the can and ate the whole plate and didn't make a speech, which was the smartest political decision he'd made in months. The legal resolution took until March. Angela Ferris opened and closed Dorothy Pruitt's estate in the correct order, with the correct filings, with Brenda Wills providing the county records that confirmed every date Dorothy's letter had claimed. The corner lot transferred to Patricia under the terms of Dorothy's holographic will, which was ultimately upheld on the grounds that the intent was clear, the handwriting was authenticated, and the conditions attached, though unusual, were sufficiently specific to be legally enforceable. The day the paperwork was final, Patricia went to Angela's office and sat in the plastic chair in the waiting room with the dead rubber plant and waited for her turn. When Angela came to the door with the documents, Patricia took them and read them through twice, slowly, and then she asked Angela to help her draft one more filing. She was putting the corner in a community land trust, irrevocable, town-held, with a single condition written directly into the trust instrument, in plain language, at Patricia's insistence. The griddle must be kept warm, or the property passes to whoever will keep it warm. Dorothy's rule, finally written into law. The law that Dorothy had been running on faith for 40 years without the paperwork to back it up. Nobody can come after it again, Angela said, reading the draft language back. That's the point. Callum built his development 3 blocks over on a parcel that had been genuinely vacant since a warehouse fire in 2009. The grocery opened in September. The pharmacy opened in November. The grandmothers stopped driving 40 minutes for their prescriptions, which had always been the actual goal, and which worked just as well 3 blocks from the depot corner as it would have on it. Callum put a small brass plaque on the wall of the grocery store entrance that nobody had asked for. This plaza is dedicated to Dorothy Pruitt, who fed this town first. He came to the Bluebird on occasional Saturday mornings and paid what he could and didn't make a production of it. The Sunday paper ran Pamela Voss's full story. The story did what stories do to a man who has built his standing on the gap between who he is and who people believe him to be. Richard's new wife's family asked questions he wasn't prepared to answer. The divorce was reopened. A judge who had no patience for perjury awarded Patricia a portion of the assets that had been obscured during the original proceedings, enough to repair the Bluebird's brakes and pay 6 months of rent on the small apartment above Donald Hatch's hardware store, from whose window she could look down at night and see the painted bird under the streetlight George had finally gotten the town to fix. She did not feel victorious about it. She felt something quieter. Something that had more to do with being done with a particular kind of attention, the attention required to be angry, to be watchful, to be ready for whatever Richard might do next than it did with winning. She took what the court awarded. paid George back for a year of tarps and propane he had declined to invoice, and put the remainder into the trust. Then she stopped thinking about Richard almost entirely, which turned out to be the thing the money had actually purchased. Kevin came on Saturdays. He'd started on dishes, as Olivia had specified, and worked his way up to the griddle over the course of 6 weeks, through a combination of genuine effort and the particular stubbornness that Patricia recognized as her own, since it had skipped his father entirely. He brought a woman named Katie to the window in August. She worked nights at the hospital one town over, and had been eating at the Bluebird for 3 weeks before Kevin introduced her, which Patricia considered an excellent sign. She fed Katie immediately and liked her immediately. And when Kevin went to load chairs, Kevin's girlfriend stayed at the window talking to Olivia about nothing specific for 20 minutes, which was how Patricia knew it was going to be fine. Kevin started keeping his own small ledger behind the counter, a running list of regulars who were short that month. He didn't call it anything. He just updated it quietly and made sure nobody fell through who didn't have to. Patricia noticed it the second week and said nothing about it, because there was nothing to say that the ledger didn't already say better. Olivia's grades came up. This was the thing she didn't announce and Patricia didn't ask about, but which became quietly evident when Olivia started doing homework at the picnic tables on weeknights instead of her kitchen table. Because the table at home was the table where she was alone, and the picnic table at the Bluebird was the table where there were people, and she had apparently concluded, without making a formal statement about it, that being among people was preferable to not being. Her mother Linda started showing up at 7 in the evening to collect her and stay for a plate. Then 7 became 6:30. Then 6. The commute from the county over was long and the nights were getting colder. And at some point between September and November, Linda had gotten a different shift schedule, which meant she was home by 5:30 3 nights a week, which meant Olivia was not alone in the house those evenings, which meant something. Nobody named any of this out loud, but it accumulated. One evening in late October, Olivia was at the picnic table with a history paper due the next morning, and Linda was at the counter eating soup, and the two of them were actually talking. Not the parallel silence Patricia had observed between them in the early weeks about something that had happened at the hospital that was apparently either alarming or funny. It was hard to tell from outside the conversation. But they were both talking, and that was the thing. Patricia turned back to the griddle and let them have it. Thomas Greer came back to the window one morning in November and told Patricia he'd gotten hired on at the county road crew. Temporary at first, with the possibility of permanent in the spring. He said it at the window without ceremony. Just put it down on the counter like a receipt he needed to leave somewhere. That's good news, Patricia said. Yeah. He looked at the counter, then at the coffee can, then at the board. I'm going to pay off the tab. The tab's nothing. Still. He put down $40. I keep my accounts. She took the $40, wrote his name in the ledger, drew a line through the amount and wrote beside it, closed and then forward. Because she had started adding that to every closed account. Because every forgiven debt in that book had always been forward. Dorothy had understood that, and Patricia had finally understood what Dorothy understood, and she was not going to stop using the word now. The spring brought the kind of mild weather that makes Ohio feel like it's apologizing for the winter. Callum's grocery had been open 6 months and the pharmacy 4, and the far end of downtown, the end that had been dark for 20 years, was lit in the evenings now, which changed the temperature of the whole street in ways that were difficult to quantify and completely obvious to anyone who had lived there long enough to remember when it wasn't. The depot corner had its own kind of change, slower and less architectural. A retired sign painter named Walter, who had eaten at the window every day since October and paid sometimes and sometimes not, and was never made to feel the difference, asked Patricia one morning in April if he could do something about the bird. Not replace it, just restore it, touch it back to what it had been before the weather took so much of it. She said yes. He worked on it for 3 days, a little at a time, in the mornings before the line started. When he was finished, the bird was blue again. Really blue. The wing lifted at that angle that meant something was about to happen and hadn't quite yet. He would not take any payment, and he would not accept a free plate in lieu of payment, and he would not be thanked without changing the subject. So Patricia did not thank him out loud, and instead added his name to the back of the ledger under a new heading she wrote there herself. Given freely. Not a debt. Never a debt. A morning in May. Patricia would keep this one for the rest of her life. The way you keep a day that turned out to be more than it knew it was when it started. She went with the old man from the gate crowd and 8 other people from the Tuesday regulars out to the county cemetery on the east side of town, to a section in the back corner where the graves had no headstones, just small numbered metal markers pressed flat into the grass. Brenda Wills had spent a week in the old records to find the number, 411. They stood around it in the wind. This small numbered square of ground that was all this town had ever given the woman who fed it buried on the county's account because there had been no family and no estate and no one to pay for anything more than the plot. The old man took off his factory cap and held it in both hands. "We were all still alive because of her," he said. "Every one of us, and we let them put her in the ground like a stranger." He looked at the marker for a long time. "I've been ashamed of a lot of things across a long life. This is the one that kept me up." The stone they set was plain granite. No dates, no scripture. Her name, and beneath it, 3 words these old men had asked for and which nobody had argued with. "She fed us." They didn't make a ceremony of it. They stood in the wind for a while and then they drove back down the hill and opened the Bluebird for lunch. Because that was the only tribute Dorothy would have sat still for. A name in granite was a fine thing. A warm griddle was a better one. Patricia had both now, and she intended to keep both. And she had the old man's voice in her head the whole drive back down. We let them put her in the ground like a stranger. The specific kind of shame that comes from understanding. Too late. That someone was carrying more than they should have had to carry alone. The summer brought a green and white awning that George rigged over a run of salvaged picnic tables. And Olivia's garden along the depot wall, tomatoes, peppers, and one sunflower she grew for reasons she would not explain and which came up taller than the fixed streetlight by the end of July. Duke got fat and comfortable in the way of dogs who have found their place. He had a bed under the counter and a standing arrangement with the griddle regarding scraps, and every child in town knew his name. Which meant every child in town had a reason to come to the corner, which meant their parents had a reason to come too. The brass plaque went up in August. Walter had designed it. Small and blue painted wood rather than metal. Because Dorothy had not been a metal plaque kind of woman, they mounted it below the serving window, at counter height, where anyone waiting in line would read it without having to look for it. Feed people first, the books can wait. A town that keeps its griddle warm can survive just about anything. The mayor came to the hanging with a proclamation making the corner a permanent town landmark and had the good judgment to keep his remarks under 2 minutes. The old man from the gate crowd pulled the cloth off the plaque and couldn't get through what he'd planned to say, so he stood with his hand flat against the blue wood and let the silence do the work, and the crowd waited with the patience of people who understood that some things take the time they take. Half the town came, not because anyone had organized it or put flyers up, but because the story had gotten into the bloodstream of the place, and people came to things like this the way they come to things that matter without needing to be asked twice. Patricia fired the griddle and fed every person who had come. The line stretched down the block in the August heat, and she worked the flat top for 4 hours without stopping, and Olivia worked beside her. And Kevin ran plates and George hauled ice from the hardware store cooler across the street, and it was loud and close and hot and exactly right, an evening in late September. Patricia was closing alone. Kevin had gone. Olivia had gone home with Linda. The corner was quiet in the way it got quiet after the good kind of busy, not empty but resting. The chairs folded against the depot wall, the awning rolled, the last of the light going gold along the brick. A woman came up the sidewalk, late 20s. Brown hair pulled back simply, a coat that was too light for the temperature. She had a bag over one shoulder and a toddler balanced on her hip, a boy of about 2 who was examining the general world with the grave focus of someone taking detailed notes. She stopped at the corner of the lot, near the doorway of the shuttered pharmacy across the street, and looked at the Bluebird with the particular caution of someone who wants something, and is not sure they're allowed to want it. Patricia recognized the posture the way you recognize a song that was playing during something important. She had worn it herself. She had seen it on Olivia. "We're closed," she called across the space between them, and then before the woman's face could travel all the way to the expression she was bracing for, "But the griddle's still hot. And I hate to waste good bread. You eating today?" The woman's chin came up. "We're fine. I have some money. I didn't ask about your money. Pay what you can. If you're short this week, eat anyway." Patricia was already at the burner. "That rule is older than I am and I'm not changing it tonight." The woman came across the lot in the careful way that people come when they're deciding to trust something they haven't been given many reasons to trust. She sat on the step. The boy investigated Duke with scientific seriousness. Duke permitted this without comment. Her name was Rebecca. She'd come from the next county over. Car that didn't always start. Lease she couldn't always cover. 2 jobs that together added up to not quite enough, which was a math that Patricia recognized from the inside out. Patricia fed them both, did not make it into a sad occasion, because it wasn't one, or rather it was and it wasn't, and the wasn't part was more important than the was part, and she had learned to treat it accordingly. Before the streetlight came on, she had Rebecca's number written in the back of the ledger, and a promise of work at the window whenever she wanted it. 3 mornings to start. More after that if she wanted more. Rebecca looked at the painted bird for a moment before she left, at the plaque beneath the window, at the line of the wing, which was gonna fly and was still about to, and had been about to for 40-some years, and showed no signs of stopping. Did she know? Rebecca asked. The woman who started this. Did she know what it would turn into? Patricia thought about it. I don't think she was thinking about what it would turn into, she said finally. I think she was thinking about the next morning. And the morning after that. She looked at the bird too. I think that's how you build something that lasts. You don't think about the whole thing. You just keep the griddle warm. By winter Rebecca could open on her own. She learned the line the way Olivia had learned it, not from instruction but from attention, which is the only way it can really be learned. She learned which customer needed to be left to eat in peace, and which one needed the second plate offered without being asked. She learned the ledger system. She learned that the word forward beside a name was not charity and not debt, but something the English language didn't have a clean word for, which is why Dorothy had left it in an action rather than a label. One cold afternoon in December, Patricia looked up from the batter she was mixing and saw Rebecca at the window. A man was at the counter who had the specific look of someone who had been in line for 20 minutes and wasn't sure the math was going to work for him. Rebecca was talking to him. Not about his situation, not about the ledger, not about any of the apparatus, just talking, the way you talk to someone at a counter. And at the end of it she pushed a plate through the window and said it simply, the way it had always been said. Pay what you can. If you're short, eat anyway. That's the only rule. The man took the plate. Patricia turned back to the batter. It was not a lesson she had taught Rebecca. It was a thing Rebecca had absorbed from the place itself, from the board, and the ledger, and the bird, and the accumulated weight of every morning the griddle had been lit. The same way Patricia had absorbed it from Dorothy's letters. The same way, she suspected. Dorothy had arrived at it herself, not from philosophy but from practical necessity. From the specific morning when a woman with a propane bottle and a flat-top griddle had cut a window in the side of an old camper and decided that the most useful thing she could do with what she had was feed the people in front of her. There's a way people in Millhaven talk about the $9 now. They tell it like a legend, which it is. The divorced woman who spent her last $9 on a trailer nobody wanted, and how the town laughed, and what was in the trailer and what came after. Visitors hear the story and shake their heads. $9, they say, as if that's the impossible part. Patricia smiles when they say it. She tells them it was the best $9 she ever spent, and she means it. All the way down. The way you mean things you've arrived at through the long route, rather than the short one. Olivia asked her once what she thought family actually was. This was a Tuesday evening in January, the two of them alone at the griddle after close, scraping the flat top with the kind of comfortable parallel silence that takes time to build and means something once it's there. Outside the window the corner was quiet and the streetlight was on, and the bird was visible through the glass. Wing up, still going. Patricia thought about it. About a son who kept a secret ledger. About a girl with sea-glass eyes who had stood in a pharmacy doorway and learned to trust. About an old man with a cane and a factory cap worn soft with 40 years of washing. About George Tanner's grease-dark hands, and Sharon Beckett's down vest, and Donald Hatch's entertainment fee. About a dead woman who had wrapped a deed in oilcloth and trusted that the world would eventually produce someone worth leaving it to. Family, she said, turns out to be whoever keeps showing up hungry. She set the scraper down and stays to do the dishes. The corner is still there. The bird is still bright. And on the mornings when the light comes up behind the old depot and the griddle starts to tick warm, and the first person in line leans on the counter to say, "Good morning," it very nearly takes off. Have you ever met someone like Dorothy Pruitt? Someone who fed people when they had nothing themselves, who kept the griddle warm when everything else had gone cold? Tell us their name in the comments. Because that's what Patricia learned: the kindness put into a place doesn't die when the person who gave it does. It waits, quiet as a sealed tin, for the next pair of hands, and the next.